Mr. Kohberger prepared to plead to these charges?
Your Honor, we will be standing silent.
Because Mr. Kohberger is standing silent, I'm going to enter not guilty pleas on each charge.
Accused killer Bryan Kohberger had an interesting arraignment by standing silent. Kerri Rawson, the daughter of infamous serial killer BTK, knows about that all too well when her father did the same. She sits down to discuss the similarities and what we should be thinking about with the alleged murderer of the Idaho Four. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. There is always so much to discuss regarding Bryan Kohberger. So many twists, turns, odd aspects of the case. And this, of course, is the former PhD grad student who is accused of burglarizing a Moscow, Idaho college house and then murdering 4 college students inside. Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Kaylee Gonsalves. And as Kohberger was just indicted by a grand jury and arraigned on his 5 felony charges, and as this case progresses towards trial, we want to get some perspective. And I want to start with a very special guest. I'm joined right now by Kerri Rawson, New York Times best-selling author of A Serial Killer's Daughter, because she is the daughter of Dennis Rader, a serial killer known as BTK, who murdered 10 people over the course of 17 years. Kerri, thank you so much for coming on to Sidebar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
One of the reasons we really wanted to have you on is because Kohberger, during his arraignment, instead of actually pleading not guilty to the charges that were read against him, he chose instead to stand silent. And the court basically entered the not guilty pleas on his behalf because he didn't say anything. And we were all thinking, why does this sound familiar? Why does this sound familiar? Well, it's my understanding your father did the exact same thing, right?
Yeah, and it had been a while since I wrote my book. So I'm a best-selling author of A Serial Killer's Daughter. And I actually had wrote about my dad standing silent. And then with everything going on, I totally forgot that Monday. And so I forgot to tell media. And then my friend on Twitter is the one that reminded everybody. So my father was arrested in February of 2005. I was notified that he was the BTK serial killer by the FBI. So we knew right away that first weekend he was guilty. The FBI called us and told us that my dad was confessing the first night to 10 murders, including 2 children. They told us they had found souvenirs from the crime scenes underneath our floorboards, driver's licenses, jewelry, things like that. So we knew right away, even before the public did, that my dad was guilty. And so we started writing my dad's letters that spring and saying, hey, if you're guilty, you should man up and do the right thing and take the plea. And my family called him, visited him, talked on the phone. And so you see these ongoing conversations between my dad and my family and his friends for months. My dad was actually trying to decide if he should plead guilty, if he wanted a trial. He said he needed to see the evidence. And my mom and I were like, what? What? You did this. What is it you need to see that they have on you? He was very conflicted by his duties to his family. He didn't want all this really bad stuff coming out. It all came out anyway. And he was warning us in letters. He's like, all this stuff is going to come out. Basically, about my father being in bondage and dressed up and all these horrible things he did with his murders. And so we're just learning a little bit about my dad. And literally a lot of stuff came out in court after he pled. So mid-April, then he's warning us. He says, look, I got an arraignment coming up.
Yeah, you know what? I have some of these letters. So if I may, I'll read you. Let me read some of them. One was, we start on pre-arraignment next week on April 19th. The dog and pony show will start. Media and rest is a mess. Then he goes on to say in a different one, there will be a non-guilty plea at some point that will give us time to review more evidence. At some point, we will make final plea. So much for all the legal. And then in another one, arraignment is May 3rd. My attorneys want me to plead not guilty to buy some time to decide our final plea. Bottom line, if I plead not guilty, I'm not selling the family out at this time. I need time to make a final decision.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going back and forth, and we didn't know what he was going to do. And so behind the scenes, we were working with the public defenders So he had a team of public defenders, and they were in our corner, victims supporting us, telling us they would pick us up from the airport, take care of us. Now, we didn't go to court, but they kept us in the loop the whole time of what was going on with my father. And they didn't even really know how to work with him. He was a very difficult defendant, obviously, to work with. But they were very patient and kind with him and with my family. And so then on May 3rd, he did stand silent. I think he didn't want it to be on the record that he was not guilty because he knew he was guilty. So he had wrote us about, he was trying to see if he qualified for the insanity defense, which of course he didn't. But there's a conversation where he was talking to his lawyers, like, can I get the insanity defense and be put in a mental hospital versus, prison? And we were having that conversation, and I was asking people, can my dad, take the insanity defense? And they're like, no, he's not insane. He knew what he was doing. And of course, I believe that now. But back then, I even thought, what if there's a death penalty? Because I didn't know. And it wasn't in play at the time for my father's crimes. So really, my dad was taking us on one of his narcissistic, psychopathic rides for months, basically trying to figure out what he was going to do. And we were begging him, please just man up and do it for our family, because we were going to have to be on the stand. We would have to testify. I would have had to testify.
Yeah.
And so finally, then he did stand silent. I think just because he didn't want it on the record. And then 6 weeks later, he did take the plea, but we didn't know what he was going to do that day. And I'm not even sure his defense did. And then when my dad did plead guilty to the 10 murders in late June of 2005, he thought all he was going to have to say is, I'm guilty on this offense. And the judge was like, no. And the judge was like, you're going to have to prove and confess that you did this. And so the judge asked him things like, on what date, what is the address, who was the victim? And my narcissistic father was really thrown, and you can see it on his face, and he gets really mad and upset. And then he can't even remember all the details, like victims' names, addresses.
And the thing that's so curious about it from a legal point of view, whether the defendant says not guilty or has the court enter it on his behalf, it has the same practical effect. And we're trying to understand, why would Bryan Kohberger have chosen to stand silent? And there's been people who said, well, maybe he's trying to open himself up for favorable negotiations because the death penalty could be on the table here. There's no insanity defense in Idaho, so we put that away. That's not on the table for him. Some have been saying, well, maybe he doesn't want the optics of him in court saying not guilty. It doesn't look right that he's trying to fight this. In your experience, based on what you saw with your father, what do you think's going on here with Kohberger?
I don't know. Based on Kohberger's mannerisms, his body, the way he was walking, I understand he probably had a vest on. Does he have diminished capacity? And that's maybe something you can talk about. Is there some sort of diminished capacity clause in Idaho, from what I'm hearing, versus an insanity defense?
It's limited, and I don't think he's going to go that route based on what we've seen. It seems that they're going to strike at evidence that he didn't do it, that that they have maybe some exculpatory evidence that he's not the killer. I just think it's so interesting why a defendant, I think you're right. I think there might be something optics wise. So it seems like your father didn't want that on the record. He didn't want it on the record that he said not guilty for a variety of different reasons. When you see what your father did and you see what Kohberger did, do you see those similarities?
Well, my father's a very interesting individual. He has rules and morals and standards of his own. He has lines he doesn't cross. So he appeared to be very law-abiding, a very strong family man, very like OCD with documents and data. To me, Kohberger strikes me the same way as somebody with this PhD, getting a PhD in cyber forensics. I could tell. So my dad, I don't think, to me, it would have been my dad lying. And my public, the way everybody perceived my father publicly, my father never lied. Of course, he's a pathological liar. So he was just all twisted up and didn't know really what to do. And when my dad stood silent and they put in the non-guilty, he was crying. My father, a psychopathic murderer, was crying at the end of that because it was bothering him so much. I think he maybe just wanted to take the guilty. So with Kohberger, maybe he just doesn't know if he is going to take a guilty plea. Maybe he needs more time. I don't think he just wanted to put it on the record out of his mouth. And you could tell if you watched the video, the 2-minute clip of the judge reading off the charges and reading the victims' names and then that long number, Kohberger's very mad, like his jaw's popping and his veins are popping. And then when the judge gets the victims' names wrong, it looks like Kohberger's mouthing Zaina and Kaylee. Like either he's really, really irritated that the judge doesn't know as much as him, or like has kind of smeared his prize.
Interesting. We had a body language expert on our prior sidebar talking about the mannerisms of demeanor of Bryan Kohberger and what that says. While I have you here, there is another connection between your father and Kohberger, and that is that I saw this report that your father, who is serving 10 consecutive life sentences, has seemingly expressed some sympathy for Kohberger. He said, "Since I spent from February 2005 to April 2005 in a cell by myself, I know how he feels, very lonely, and soon letters started to come in. I read a lot of the Bible and wrote poetry." I don't know if you had an opportunity to see those comments from your father, but I was curious what you made of that.
Oh yeah, I see everything. I've got us both on Google Alerts so I can keep track of what my father's doing. Um,
Yep.
I mean, so when my father was arrested, he realized basically the gig was up and that everything was going to come out. And he had a very hard time understanding what had happened because for my father, he always knew he was BTK. So he knew he was BTK and a family man. And he walked around with a secret for 31 years. And so he didn't understand. He assumed our family just had accepted him. I think he's not all there, obviously. And so when we found out, of course, everything changed and he didn't understand what had happened. Like, where did my family go? Why aren't they just my family? And then he realized we were the eighth victim family. And he was very rattled, lonely, embarrassed, depressed, suicidal at times those first months. And honestly, I don't think my father wanted to be in court. He's very uncomfortable in court, very uncomfortable around law enforcement, lawyers, professionals. And he was no longer in control. So when you put somebody like my dad or Kohberger in court, they're no longer in control. They have absolutely no control. And so maybe Kohberger standing silent was a little bit of just exerting just a tiny bit of Kohberger control.
And the fact that your father has this sympathy for him and what he's going through.
I mean, who else would know what it's like to be be accused as an infamous criminal than an infamous criminal? Plus, my dad's just trying to assert himself back into the media and make himself relevant.
By the way, I before I let you go, I had to ask you about something. So we know that Kohberger, before he was arrested, as I mentioned, he was studying criminology, and he was being taught by Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who's actually the leading authority on the BTK killings. My understanding at the time of this recording, she has still not come out and spoken about the Kohberger case. That connection, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, I was curious what you thought about that.
It was a shocker to me. So I was really relieved when Kohberger was arrested. Very relieved on December 30th. And then about 30 seconds later, it started coming out that he was a student under Dr. Ramsland at DeSales University for his master's program and probably the end of his bachelor's. And then I had PTSD and it just completely flared up. Just awful. Dr. Ramsland co-wrote a book with my father about my father's crimes. They're very close, like colleagues, friends. She goes and visits, calls him, they play chess. So the fact that a so-called expert on serial killers, not just my dad, but a so-called expert on serial killers and psychopaths missed one right under her nose. Plus, I believe recommended him for the PhD program in Washington is what the word is. It's not, I mean, it happens. I mean, my dad was under our nose for 30 years. So it happens. It's just concerning to me. And she's not doing media, but I think it's probably because the gag, or she's going to be called as a witness.
Have you heard from her at all?
No, we're not in direct touch anymore. We
Gotcha.
don't have an ongoing relationship.
Well, listen, I think that this is, it's an interesting study with Kohberger. It's eerie similarities with your father. Kerri, I know this is always difficult to talk about. So not only do we appreciate you taking the time to come onto Sidebar, but also revisiting these moments in your life. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.